History will remember Ibrahim not just as the youngest head of state in the world, but as the leader who reminded Africa of its power and potential. Even as his story continues to unfold, the legacy he has already created reaches far beyond any single policy or military victory. The young man from Bondakai who dreamed of African independence has fundamentally changed how an entire continent sees itself and its possibilities. His greatest achievement may be something that cannot be measured in statistics or economic data: the restoration of African dignity and confidence. For too many decades after independence, African leaders had accepted the idea that their continent needed constant guidance and intervention from former colonial powers. They believed that African countries were too weak, too poor, or too divided to succeed on their own. This mindset had become so deeply rooted that even well-meaning leaders often sought foreign approval before making important decisions about their own countries. Ibrahim shattered this psychological dependence by proving that young African leaders could chart independent courses and succeed on their own terms. The practical changes Ibrahim brought to Burkina Faso serve as a model that other African countries are already beginning to follow. His renegotiation of mining contracts has shown that African governments can demand fair compensation for their natural resources. His investment in education with African-focused curricula has demonstrated that schools can teach children to be proud of their heritage while preparing them for modern careers. His community-based approach to security has proven that African solutions can be more effective than foreign military intervention. The Alliance of Sahel states that Ibrahim helped create represents a new model for African cooperation that bypasses former colonial powers entirely. Instead of competing with each other for foreign aid and investment, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are working together to solve common problems and build shared prosperity. This partnership has created trade relationships that keep African wealth within Africa, security arrangements that protect African interests, and cultural exchanges that strengthen African identity. Other African countries are watching these developments with great interest and beginning to form similar partnerships. The East African community has started discussing policies that would reduce dependence on European and American markets. The Economic Community of West African States is reconsidering trade agreements that have favored foreign companies over African businesses. The African Union has begun promoting Ibrahim's ideas about African. The economic impact of Ibrahim's revolution extends far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. His success in demanding better terms from international mining companies has encouraged other African governments to review their own resource extraction agreements. Countries across the continent are discovering that they have been accepting far less compensation than their resources are worth, and they are beginning to demand fairer deals. This shift in economic relationships is creating new opportunities for African businesses and workers. As governments insist that more mineral processing be done locally instead of shipping raw materials abroad, new factories and refineries are being built that employ African workers and generate tax revenue for African governments. The jobs being created pay better wages and provide better training than the basic extraction work that foreign companies had previously offered. Ibrahim's emphasis on education has inspired similar investments across Africa. Countries that have been spending most of their budgets on debt payments, two foreign banks are redirecting resources towards schools and universities. The curricula being developed emphasize African achievements and capabilities rather than the colonial narratives that had taught generations of African children to see themselves as inferior to Europeans and Americans. The cultural transformation that Ibrahim has helped inspire may be his most lasting contribution to African development. A generation of young Africans who had grown up believing that success meant copying Western lifestyles and values are rediscovering pride in their own traditions and capabilities. This psychological change is creating the foundation for economic and political changes that will continue long after Ibrahim's time in power ends. African artists, writers, and intellectuals are producing work that celebrates African themes and addresses African audiences rather than seeking approval from foreign critics. African entrepreneurs are starting businesses that solve African problems with African resources rather than depending on foreign technology and investment. African scholars are developing theories and solutions based on African experiences rather than simply applying Western ideas to African situations. The influence Ibrahim has had on young people may be his most important legacy. Across Africa, medical students who had planned to emigrate after graduation are choosing to remain and build better healthcare systems in their home countries. Engineers and scientists are starting companies focused on African development rather than seeking employment with foreign corporations. Teachers and professors are developing educational materials that help African children understand their own potential and possibilities. This generational change is already visible in African politics, where younger leaders are being elected who share Ibrahim's commitment to independence and dignity. These new leaders may not all follow Ibrahim's exact policies, but they share his refusal to accept that Africa must remain dependent on foreign guidance and assistance. They understand that genuine development requires African solutions to African problems. The international community's reaction to Ibrahim's success has also contributed to his legacy. The angry responses from former colonial powers and international financial institutions have confirmed to many Africans that Ibrahim was threatening systems that had kept Africa poor and dependent. Every criticism and sanction has strengthened African resolve to pursue independent development paths. Ibrahim's personal example of modest living and dedication to service has set new standards for African leadership that future generations will remember and follow. At a time when many African politicians enriched themselves while their people suffered, Ibrahim demonstrated that true leaders serve their people rather than exploiting them. His simple lifestyle and direct communication with ordinary citizens have restored trust between African governments and the people they serve. The young revolutionary who once walked barefoot on the red earth of Bandakai has planted seeds of consciousness that will continue growing for decades to come. The children who are growing up hearing stories about Ibrahim's courage will become leaders who refuse to accept limitations on African potential. The students who are studying his speeches will become teachers who pass his ideas to future generations. The workers who have benefited from his policies will demand that future leaders maintain his commitment to African interests. Ibrahim's story is still being written, but his legacy is already secure. He has proven that age is not a barrier to effective leadership, that military background does not prevent democratic governance, and that small countries can challenge global systems of exploitation. Most importantly, he has shown that the dreams of village children can change the world when they are combined with education, determination, and unwavering commitment to justice. The red earth of Bandakai that shaped Ibrahim's childhood now supports a tree whose branches stretch across continents, providing inspiration and hope for all who believe in the possibility of genuine freedom and self. This is the true measure of Ibrahim's legacy, not just what he accomplished during his time in power, but what he made others believe they could accomplish for themselves and their children. The struggle for African independence that began with the colonial resistance movements has found new life in the leadership of Ibrahim. The boy who listened to stories about Thomas Sankara under the baobab tree in Bandakai has become the man who made those stories real again for a new generation. His legacy will live on in every African child who grows up believing that their continent can be great, their countries can be prosperous, and their people can determine their own destiny. The impact of Ibrahim's revolution extended far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso like waves spreading across a vast ocean. What had begun as one young man's dream of African independence was becoming a continental awakening that inspired millions of people who had never heard of the small village of Bandakai. From the bustling markets of Lagos to the university campuses of Cairo, from the mining towns of South Africa to the fishing villages of Senegal, young Africans began to see new possibilities for their own countries and their own lives. The power of social media amplified Ibrahim's message in ways that previous African revolutionaries could never have imagined. His speeches were translated into dozens of languages and shared millions of times across platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. Young people created videos explaining his ideas to their friends and communities. Artists painted murals of his image on walls in cities across the continent. Musicians composed songs celebrating his courage and vision. In Ghana, university students organized discussion groups to study Ibrahim's speeches and analyze how his ideas might apply to their own country's challenges. They talked about Ghana's dependence on foreign aid and international loans, questioning why a country with significant gold deposits and agricultural potential needed to borrow money from foreign banks. These students began to demand that their own leaders pursue more independent policies that would benefit ordinary Ghanaians rather than foreign corporations. Kenya's young intellectuals were particularly inspired by Ibrahim's emphasis on controlling natural resources for national benefit. They organized conferences and wrote articles examining how international companies had been extracting wealth from Kenya's tea plantations, coffee farms, and tourism industry, while most Kenyans remained poor. Ibrahim's example gave them the courage to propose alternatives that had previously seemed impossible or unrealistic. The most dramatic immediate impact occurred in neighboring Niger, where young military officers had been watching events in Burkina Faso with great interest. Like their counterparts in Ibrahim's movement, these Nigerian officers were frustrated with their government's inability to address security challenges and its continued dependence on French military support. They saw how Ibrahim had successfully challenged foreign domination and decided to follow his example. On July 26, 2023, less than a year after Ibrahim's coup, young officers in Niger's military carried out their own revolution. They explicitly cited Ibrahim's success as inspiration for their actions and praised his leadership and speeches announcing their takeover. The new Nigerian leaders declared that they would end French military presence in their country and pursue policies designed to benefit ordinary Nigerians rather than foreign interests. The connection between the revolutions in Burkina Faso and Niger was not coincidental. Ibrahim had been quietly building relationships with like-minded officers in neighboring countries, sharing ideas and strategies for achieving genuine independence. This network of revolutionary soldiers represented a new generation of African military leaders who understood that their country's problems were interconnected and required coordinated solutions. Mali's military government, which had taken power in 2020, also moved closer to Ibrahim's positions after seeing his success. Mali's leaders began expelling French forces from their territory and seeking alternative security partnerships that did not involve surrendering sovereignty to foreign powers. The three countries began coordinating their policies and supporting each other against international pressure. This cooperation led to the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States, a partnership between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso that represented the most significant challenge to French influence in West Africa since independence. Under Ibrahim's leadership, this alliance began developing common positions on economic policy, security, cooperation, and international relations that prioritized African interests over foreign demands. The cultural impact of Ibrahim's revolution was equally important. Across Africa, young people began expressing greater pride in their African identity and heritage. Traditional African languages experienced a renewed popularity among urban youth who had previously preferred to speak European languages. African fashion, music, and art began reflecting themes of independence and self-determination that echoed Ibrahim's political message. Universities across the continent began organizing academic conferences to study Ibrahim's political philosophy and its implications for African development. Scholars who had previously focused on Western theories of economics and politics started paying more attention to African thinkers and indigenous solutions to African problems. Ibrahim's success had demonstrated that African leaders could chart independent courses without following Western models. The entertainment industry also reflected this cultural shift. Nollywood films from Nigeria began featuring stories about African heroes who stood up to foreign exploitation. South African musicians composed songs celebrating African unity and independence. Fashion designers created clothing lines inspired by traditional African patterns and symbols that emphasized cultural pride and resistance to foreign domination. International media struggled to understand and categorize Ibrahim's impact. Western news outlets often portrayed him negatively, focusing on his military background while ignoring the substantive changes he was implementing. However, alternative media platforms and social media allowed his message to reach global audiences directly, bypassing traditional gatekeepers who might distort or suppress his ideas. Young people in the African diaspora, living in Europe and North America, also felt the inspiration of Ibrahim's example. Second and third generation African immigrants began reconnecting with their ancestral cultures and questioning narratives that portrayed Africa as backward or dependent. Some began planning to return to Africa to contribute to the development projects that leaders like Ibrahim were launching. The economic implications of Ibrahim's influence were beginning to appear in measurable ways. African countries started negotiating harder bargains with foreign companies seeking access to natural resources. Regional trade between African nations increased as leaders followed. Ibrahim's example of prioritizing African partnerships over dependence on former colonial powers. Investment in African infrastructure and education grew as governments redirected resources from debt payments to development projects. Even in countries where governments had not changed, civil society organizations began demanding greater transparency and accountability from their leaders. Citizens asked harder questions about how natural resource revenues were being used and why foreign companies seemed to benefit more than local communities from African wealth. Ibrahim's example had shown that change was possible, making it difficult for corrupt leaders to maintain that nothing could be improved. The ripple effects of Ibrahim's revolution were creating a new generation of African leaders and thinkers who refused to accept limitations that previous generations had considered unchangeable. Medical students who had planned to emigrate after graduation began choosing to remain in Africa to build better healthcare systems. Engineers and scientists started companies focused on solving African problems with African solutions. Artists and writers began telling African stories from African perspectives rather than seeking approval from foreign audiences. Perhaps most importantly, Ibrahim had restored something that had been missing from African politics for decades. Young people across the continent began believing that their countries could become prosperous and respected without surrendering their independence or dignity. This psychological transformation was perhaps even more significant than any specific policy change, because it created the foundation for all future progress. The boy from Bandakai had become the catalyst for a continental transformation that would continue long after his own time in power ended. His example had proven that revolutionary change was still possible in the 21st century, inspiring millions of people to imagine and work toward futures that honored African capabilities and aspirations. Revolutionary leadership had never been easy, and Ibrahim quickly discovered that challenging decades of foreign domination would bring powerful enemies who would stop at nothing to destroy his movement. The young leader who had dreamed of African independence from his village in Bam now faced the full force of international opposition determined to prevent his vision from succeeding. The storms that gathered against him tested not only his resolve, but his ability to protect his people while building the independent nation he had promised. The first wave of resistance came from the international community, particularly from France and other Western nations that had profited enormously from Africa's dependence. These countries had tolerated corruption, human rights abuses, and economic mismanagement for decades under previous African leaders, but suddenly became deeply concerned about democracy and constitutional government when Ibrahim challenged their interests. French President Emmanuel Macron led the international criticism, claiming that military coups were unacceptable in the modern world and that Ibrahim's government lacked legitimacy. This criticism rang hollow to many Africans who remembered that France had supported brutal dictators like Mobutu Sese Seko in Congo and Hopal Boigny in Ivory Coast for decades, without any concern for democratic values. The real issue was not democracy, but the threat that Ibrahim's example posed to French economic and political control across Africa. Economic pressure followed quickly behind diplomatic criticism. International financial institutions threatened to suspend loans and development programs unless Ibrahim reversed his policies and accepted foreign military presence. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund, which had provided funding to previous governments despite widespread corruption, suddenly discovered concerns about governance and transparency that they claimed made continued cooperation impossible. These economic threats were designed to create hardship for ordinary that would undermine support for Ibrahim's government. Foreign aid that had provided funding for schools and hospitals was suspended, creating immediate challenges for government services. International investors were warned away from Burkina Faso, making it difficult to attract the investment needed for economic development projects. But Ibrahim had anticipated these pressures and prepared his people for the sacrifices that genuine independence would require. In speeches broadcast across the country, he explained that temporary hardship was the price of permanent freedom. He reminded his people that their ancestors had endured much greater sacrifices to resist colonial conquest, and that the current generation had the opportunity to complete the liberation struggle that previous generations had begun. The security situation remained Ibrahim's most serious challenge. Terrorist groups operating in northern Burkina Faso had grown stronger during years of ineffective government response, and they controlled significant territory where government forces rarely ventured. These groups used violence and intimidation to prevent normal economic activity and government services, creating conditions that critics used to argue that Ibrahim's rejection of foreign military assistance was making the problem worse. Ibrahim understood that sustainable security could only come from solutions that had genuine, popular support rather than foreign military intervention. He began investing heavily in community-based defense programs that trained local people to protect their own villages and towns. These programs built on traditional African methods of collective security that had protected communities for centuries before colonial governments dismantled them. The young leader also recognized that military solutions alone could never solve the terrorism problem. Terrorist groups recruited members from communities where young people had no economic opportunities and felt disconnected from their own government. Ibrahim's programs to improve education, create jobs, and invest in rural development were designed to address these root causes of extremism. While military operations dealt with immediate security threats, internal opposition proved to be as challenging as international pressure. Not all immediately embraced the radical changes their young leader was implementing. Urban elites who had prospered under the previous system of foreign dependence resented policies that threatened their privileged positions. Some business leaders who had grown wealthy through contracts with foreign companies worried that increased emphasis on local ownership would reduce their profits. Religious and traditional leaders expressed different concerns about the pace and direction of change. Some worried that Ibrahim's emphasis on African culture and independence might conflict with religious teachings that stressed universal brotherhood and peaceful coexistence. Others feared that rapid social changes might undermine traditional customs and authority structures that had maintained social stability for generations. Political opposition parties that had been marginalized by the military takeover sought to exploit any difficulties or setbacks as evidence that Ibrahim's approach was failing. They organized protests and used social media to spread criticism, sometimes exaggerating problems or spreading false information to undermine public confidence in the revolutionary government. The personal cost of leadership weighed heavily on Ibrahim, despite his public appearance of confidence and determination. At an age when most people were focused on building careers and starting families, he carried the enormous responsibility of an entire nation's hopes and struggles. The constant threat of assassination meant that he could never relax or move freely among his people, the way he had during his youth in Bam. Death threats arrived regularly from opponents who viewed him as a dangerous obstacle to their interests. Intelligence reports warned of plots by foreign agents and domestic enemies, who wanted to eliminate him before his revolutionary example could inspire similar movements in other African countries. The knowledge that powerful forces wanted him dead was a daily reality that required constant vigilance and security measures that separated him from the ordinary people he served. Sleep became difficult as Ibrahim wrestled with the weight of decisions that affected millions of lives. Every policy choice carried risks and potential consequences that could help or harm his people. The responsibility of leadership meant that mistakes could not be easily corrected and that wrong decisions might set back the cause of African independence for decades. Despite these enormous pressures, Ibrahim drew strength from the support he received from Orne, who understood what he was trying to accomplish. Letters and messages from farmers, students, workers, and mothers reminded him that his struggle was not just about political power, but about creating a better future for people who had suffered too long under systems designed to exploit them. International solidarity also provided encouragement during difficult moments. Messages of support arrived from young people across Africa, who saw Ibrahim as a symbol of their own hopes for genuine independence. Revolutionary movements in other countries expressed admiration for his courage and offered assistance when possible. The storms of resistance that gathered against Ibrahim were fierce and unrelenting, but they also proved that his revolution was real and threatening to those who profited from Africa's continued dependence. Every attack and criticism confirmed that he was on the right path, even when that path led through darkness and uncertainty toward a future that only he and his supporters could envision. The first few weeks after taking power would determine whether Ibrahim was just another military leader, seeking personal gain, or truly the revolutionary he claimed to be. As the dust settled from the September coup, the young captain faced the enormous challenge of transforming his idealistic vision into practical policies that could change his country's destiny. The eyes of Africa and the world were watching to see if this 34-year-old soldier could deliver on the bold promises he had made to his people. Ibrahim understood that his revolution would be judged not by his words but by his actions. Within days of taking power, he began implementing policies that proved his commitment to genuine change was real. His first major decision sent shockwaves through the international community and filled ordinary with hope and pride. He announced that all French military forces would be required to leave Burkina Faso immediately. This demand was not made in anger or hatred toward French people, but from a clear understanding that genuine independence was impossible while foreign armies controlled African soil. Ibrahim explained to his people that no country could be truly free while depending on another nation's military for its security. The presence of French forces had created a relationship of dependence that prevented Burkina Faso from developing its own military capabilities and making its own strategic decisions. The French government reacted with surprise and anger to Ibrahim's demand. They had grown accustomed to African leaders who welcomed their military presence and sought their approval for important decisions. French officials tried to pressure Ibrahim by threatening to withdraw development aid and diplomatic support. But these threats only confirmed that Ibrahim had made the right decision. A truly independent country should not need foreign approval for its policies. Ibrahim's second major policy change focused on the economic relationships that had kept Burkina Faso poor despite its natural wealth. He ordered a complete review of all mining contracts and international agreements that previous governments had signed with foreign companies. His geological training gave him the technical knowledge needed to understand these complex agreements and identify the ways they had been structured to benefit foreign interests rather than Burkina Faso's people. What Ibrahim discovered during this review made him even more determined to pursue revolutionary change. Mining companies had negotiated contracts that allowed them to extract valuable minerals, while paying extremely low taxes and royalties to the government. These companies employed mostly foreign workers and managers, providing few jobs for local people. They also used accounting methods that minimized their reported profits, reducing the already small payments they made to Burkina Faso. Ibrahim began the process of renegotiating these unfair agreements. He insisted that mining companies pay fair taxes on their profits and employ more workers in skilled positions. He also demanded that a larger percentage of mineral processing be done within Burkina Faso rather than shipping raw materials abroad for processing in foreign factories. These changes would create more jobs for local people and generate more revenue for the government to spend on schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. The young leader's approach to regional cooperation represented a fundamental shift in how African countries could work together. Instead of competing with each other for foreign investment and aid, Ibrahim promoted the idea that African nations should form partnerships based on mutual benefit and shared values. He began building closer relationships with leaders in Mali and Niger, who shared his commitment to genuine independence and Pan-African unity. These regional partnerships were not just political statements but practical arrangements that could help all participating countries become stronger and more prosperous. Ibrahim proposed sharing military intelligence and coordinating security operations against terrorist groups that operated across national borders. He also suggested developing trade relationships that would reduce dependence on former colonial powers and create markets for African products within Africa itself. Education became one of Ibrahim's highest priorities, because he understood that lasting change required a population capable of thinking independently and critically about their country's challenges and opportunities. He increased government spending on schools and universities while promoting curricula that emphasized African history, culture, and achievements rather than European perspectives that had dominated colonial education systems. Ibrahim also invested heavily in technical and vocational training programs that would give young the skills needed to work in mining, manufacturing, and other industries that could drive economic development. He understood that his country would never be truly independent as long as it depended on foreign experts for technical knowledge and skilled labor. Healthcare improvements were another area where Ibrahim's government made immediate progress. He increased funding for hospitals and clinics, while also promoting preventive healthcare programs that could keep people healthy at lower cost. He understood that a healthy population was essential for economic development, and that access to healthcare was a basic human right that government should guarantee. Infrastructure development received increased attention under Ibrahim's leadership. His government began repairing roads, building new schools and hospitals, and expanding access to electricity and clean water in rural areas. These projects were designed not just to improve living conditions, but also to demonstrate that genuine independence could deliver concrete benefits to ordinary people. Ibrahim's foreign policy represented a complete break with the past. Instead of automatically supporting Western positions in international forums, Burkina Faso began developing relationships with countries that offered partnership based on mutual respect rather than dependence. This included stronger ties with Russia, China, and other African countries that had achieved greater levels of independence from Western influence. The young leader's communication style also set him apart from previous African politicians. He spoke directly to his people in language they could understand, explaining complex issues in simple terms, and always connecting government policies to their daily lives. His speeches were broadcast not just on official media, but shared widely on social media platforms, where young Africans could access and discuss his ideas. Ibrahim's personal lifestyle remained simple and modest despite his position of power. He continued to live modestly and refused the luxury that many African leaders considered normal. This consistency between his words and actions built trust with ordinary people who had grown cynical about politicians who preached sacrifice while enriching themselves. Within months of taking power, Ibrahim had proven that his revolution was real and substantive. His policies were creating measurable improvements in his people's lives, while building foundations for long-term independence and prosperity. The vision he had developed during years of study and military service was finally being implemented, and the results were inspiring hope not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa. The young revolutionary from Bondakai had become a leader whose actions matched his ideals, proving that genuine change was possible when someone with the right combination of vision, courage, and commitment gained the power to implement their ideas. The air in Ouagadougou was thick with tension on the morning of September 30th, 2022. Captain Ibrahim had barely slept the night before, not because he was nervous, but because he was making final preparations for the most important day of his life. After years of watching his country suffer under weak leadership and foreign domination, the moment had finally arrived to take decisive action. The revolution that had been growing in his heart since childhood was about to become reality. The immediate cause of the coup was the failure of Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, who had taken power in January 2022 with promises to improve security and governance. Damiba had gained support by criticizing the previous civilian government's inability to stop terrorist attacks that were killing innocent people across northern Burkina Faso. Many had hoped that military leadership would bring the strength and decisiveness needed to solve their country's problems. But after 8 months in power, Damiba had disappointed those hopes. The security situation continued to worsen, with terrorist groups controlling even more territory than before. Government soldiers were still poorly equipped and inadequately trained. Corruption remained widespread among officials who seemed more interested in personal enrichment than public service. Most troubling to Ibrahim and his fellow officers, Damiba appeared to be following the same patterns of dependence on foreign assistance that had failed previous leaders. The breaking point came when evidence emerged that Damiba was secretly negotiating to allow French military forces to establish a permanent base in Burkina Faso. This revelation, Ibrahim's worst fears about the direction of the country's leadership. Instead of working toward genuine independence, Damiba seemed prepared to formalize the kind of foreign military presence that had kept African countries weak and dependent for decades. Ibrahim and his circle of trusted officers had been planning their response for months. They called themselves the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration, a name that reflected their commitment to protecting Burkina Faso's sovereignty and restoring the revolutionary ideals that Thomas Sankara had represented. These were not power-hungry soldiers seeking personal advancement, but ideologically committed patriots who believed that their country's survival depended on fundamental change. The planning process had been careful and thorough. Ibrahim understood that successful revolutions required more than just military force. They needed clear objectives, popular support, and the ability to govern effectively after taking power. He had studied historical examples of both successful and failed coups, learning from the mistakes and successes of previous revolutionary movements. Unlike many military coups in African history, Ibrahim's movement had a detailed political program that went far beyond simply changing leaders. They planned to end foreign military presence, renegotiate unfair economic agreements, invest heavily in education and healthcare, and build genuine partnerships with other African countries. These were not vague promises made to win popular support, but concrete policies based on years of careful analysis and planning. The network of officers supporting Ibrahim included some of the most capable and principled soldiers in Burkina Faso's military. They had served together in operations against terrorist groups and had witnessed firsthand the failures of the existing system. More importantly, they shared Ibrahim's vision of what their country could become with proper leadership and genuine independence. On the morning of September 3rd, Ibrahim's forces moved with precision and discipline that reflected months of careful preparation. Key government buildings, communication centers, and military installations were secured quickly and efficiently. The operation was designed to minimize violence and disruption to civilian life. This was not a chaotic power grab by ambitious soldiers, but a carefully orchestrated transfer of authority from failed leadership to revolutionary government. The speed and effectiveness of the coup surprised many observers, but it should not have been unexpected. Ibrahim and his allies had spent years building support within the military and understanding exactly what needed to be done. When they finally acted, they did so with the confidence of leaders who had thoroughly prepared for the enormous responsibilities they were assuming. The announcement of the coup was broadcast on national radio and television by Ibrahim himself. Speaking in clear, simple language that ordinary could understand, he explained why the military had been forced to take action. He criticized the previous government's failures and outlined his movement's plans for creating a truly independent and prosperous Burkina Faso. What made Ibrahim's announcement different from typical coup declarations was its ideological clarity and Pan-African vision. He did not just promise to solve immediate problems, but articulated a comprehensive alternative to the neo-colonial system that had kept Africa dependent and poor. He spoke about the need for African unity, the importance of controlling natural resources, and the necessity of ending foreign military interference. The reaction from ordinary was overwhelmingly positive. Crowds gathered in the streets of Ouagadougou and other cities to celebrate the change in leadership. Young people especially were excited by Ibrahim's message of independence and dignity. They saw in him a leader who represented their own aspirations for a better future, someone who would not compromise with foreign powers or corrupt elites. International reactions were predictably negative, particularly from France and other Western countries that had benefited from the previous system of influence and exploitation. They expressed concern about democratic norms and constitutional government, despite having tolerated decades of corruption and mismanagement under previous leaders. Their criticism only confirmed to many Africans that Ibrahim was on the right path. At just 34 years old, Ibrahim had become the youngest head of state in the world. But more importantly, he had become the leader of a movement that would inspire similar changes across Africa. The boy from Bondakai who had dreamed of African independence had grown into the man who would make that dream a reality. The coup of September 30th was not just a change of government in one small African country. It was the beginning of a new phase in the struggle for African liberation. Led by a young revolutionary who understood that genuine independence required the courage to challenge powerful interests and the vision to imagine a completely different future. Standing before his nation as its new leader, Ibrahim embodied the hopes of millions of young Africans who had been waiting for someone with the courage to say no to foreign domination and yes to African dignity. The revolution had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The military uniform felt different on Ibrahim's shoulders than it did on other young soldiers. While his fellow recruits saw military service as a career opportunity or a path to steady income, Ibrahim wore the uniform with a deeper sense of purpose. He understood that he was not just training to be a soldier. He was preparing to become a leader who could defend Africa's interests against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. Ibrahim's early days in military training revealed the same dedication and intelligence that had marked his academic career. His instructors quickly noticed that this young geological engineer approached military problems with the same analytical thinking, he had learned in his scientific studies, when other soldiers focused only on following orders. Ibrahim tried to understand the strategic principles behind military operations. He wanted to know not just how to execute commands, but why certain decisions were made, and what alternatives might exist. The physical demands of military training were challenging, but not overwhelming for someone who had grown up doing hard labor in rural Burkina Faso. Ibrahim's body was already strong from years of farm work and walking long distances to school. More importantly, his mind was disciplined from years of intense study and intellectual development. He approached military training with the same systematic dedication that had made him successful in university. But military service also exposed Ibrahim to realities about his country that disturbed him deeply. During training, exercises, and deployment to different regions of Burkina Faso, he witnessed firsthand the poverty and suffering of ordinary people. He saw villages without clean water or electricity, children who could not attend school because their families needed them to work, and young people with no hope of finding decent employment. What made these observations particularly painful was Ibrahim's growing understanding of why such conditions existed. His geological training had taught him about the vast mineral wealth buried beneath Burkina Faso's soil. The country had significant deposits of gold, manganese, zinc, and other valuable resources. Yet somehow this natural wealth was not translating into prosperity for the people who lived above it. Ibrahim began to investigate how mining operations actually worked in his country. What he discovered filled him with anger and determination to create change. Foreign companies had negotiated contracts that gave them the right to extract valuable minerals, while paying very little to the Burkina Faso government. Even worse, these companies employed mostly foreign workers and managers, providing few jobs for local people. The profits from Burkina Faso's natural resources were flowing out of the country, while ordinary remained poor. The security situation in the Sahel region was becoming increasingly dangerous during Ibrahim's military service. Terrorist groups with connections to international networks were attacking villages, kidnapping people, and disrupting normal life across northern Burkina Faso. The government's response to this crisis opened Ibrahim's eyes to another form of foreign domination that was perhaps even more harmful than economic exploitation. France, the former colonial power, maintained military forces in several West African countries supposedly to help fight terrorism. French soldiers and advisors played important roles in planning, security operations, and training local forces. On the surface, this assistance seemed helpful and necessary. But Ibrahim began to understand that French military involvement served French interests more than African interests. The French military presence ensured that African governments remained dependent on foreign support for their most basic security needs. This dependence gave France a significant influence over political decisions in countries like Burkina Faso. African leaders who wanted to maintain French military protection had to avoid policies that might displease their French partners. This meant that truly independent foreign policy or economic policy became almost impossible. Ibrahim also observed that French military operations seemed designed more to protect French economic interests than to solve Africa's security problems. French forces were quick to intervene when mining facilities or other French investments were threatened, but they were often slow to respond when ordinary African civilians faced danger. This pattern suggested that the fight against terrorism was being used as an excuse to maintain military control over African countries. During joint operations with French forces, Ibrahim noticed cultural attitudes that reminded him of the colonial period he had studied in university. Some French officers treated their African counterparts as junior partners, who needed constant guidance and supervision. They assumed that Africans lacked the intelligence or capability to develop their own security strategies. These attitudes reinforced Ibrahim's belief that genuine independence required ending all forms of foreign military presence. The inadequacy of equipment and training provided to Burkina Faso's military forces became another source of frustration for Ibrahim. While foreign advisors received the latest technology and comfortable living conditions, local soldiers often lacked basic supplies and proper training. This disparity made it difficult for African forces to operate effectively, which in turn justified continued reliance on foreign assistance. Ibrahim began to see this as a deliberate strategy to maintain dependence, rather than build genuine local capability. Ibrahim's geological knowledge gave him unique insights into the connection between natural resources and security problems. He understood that terrorist groups were often funded through illegal mining operations and smuggling networks. The same weak governance that allowed foreign companies to exploit mineral resources legally also created opportunities for criminal organizations to exploit resources illegally. Solving the security crisis would require addressing the broader problem of resource management and foreign domination. As Ibrahim advanced through military ranks, he began building relationships with other young officers who shared his concerns about their country's direction. These conversations were necessarily careful and private, but they revealed that Ibrahim was not alone in his frustrations. A new generation of African military leaders was emerging with different ideas about sovereignty, development, and security. These young officers had been educated during the internet age and had access to information and perspectives that previous generations lacked. They could see how other countries had achieved genuine independence and prosperity. They understood that the problems facing Africa were not inevitable or unsolvable, but were the result of specific policies and relationships that could be changed with sufficient determination and courage. Ibrahim's reputation as a thoughtful and principled officer began to attract attention from both his superiors and his peers. Some senior officers appreciated his analytical abilities and dedication to service. Others became suspicious of his questions and his obvious intelligence. Ibrahim learned to be careful about expressing his views openly while continuing to develop his understanding of how real change might be achieved. The transformation of Ibrahim from dedicated soldier to revolutionary leader was gradual but inevitable. Each injustice he witnessed, each example of foreign interference he observed, and each conversation with like-minded officers strengthened his conviction that fundamental change was necessary. The fire of injustice that burned within him was not destructive anger, but the focused determination of a leader who had seen enough suffering and was prepared to do something about it. By the time Ibrahim reached the rank of captain, he had developed a clear vision of what needed to be done and a network of officers who were prepared to support revolutionary change. The young man from Bondakai had become a military leader with the knowledge, skills, and determination needed to challenge the entire system that kept Africa dependent and poor. The fire of injustice had forged a revolutionary who would soon change the course of history. The journey from the dusty roads of Bondakai to the halls of higher education was like stepping into a completely different world. Ibrahim carried with him the values and wisdom of his village, but now he would face new challenges and opportunities that would shape him into the leader he was destined to become. The transition from rural student to university scholar marked a crucial phase in his development, where academic knowledge would merge with practical understanding to create a revolutionary mind. Ibrahim's exceptional performance in secondary school had earned him a place at university to study geological engineering. This choice was not random or made simply for career prospects. Ibrahim understood that geology was the science of understanding what lay beneath the surface, and he believed this knowledge was essential for any African leader who wanted to control his country's natural resources. Too many African nations had been exploited because their leaders did not understand the true value of what lay buried in their soil. The university environment was both exciting and challenging for a young man from a small village. Ibrahim found himself surrounded by students from different backgrounds, some from wealthy urban families who had attended expensive private schools. Initially, he felt the gap between his simple upbringing and their sophisticated experiences. But Ibrahim quickly discovered that his rural background had given him advantages that his urban classmates lacked. He had learned to work hard, to value education deeply, and to think independently about complex problems. In his geology classes, Ibrahim excelled at understanding the technical aspects of mineral exploration and extraction. He learned about different types of rocks and how valuable minerals formed over millions of years. He studied the methods used to locate and extract gold, uranium, diamonds, and other precious resources. But more importantly, he began to understand the economic and political implications of mineral wealth. He learned how mining contracts were structured and why African countries often received very little benefit from their natural resources. The laboratory work fascinated Ibrahim because it taught him to analyze samples carefully and draw accurate conclusions from evidence. This scientific approach to problem solving would later influence his political thinking. Just as he learned to examine rock samples to understand their composition, he would learn to analyze political and economic systems to understand how they really worked and how they could be changed. Outside the classroom, Ibrahim encountered ideas and perspectives that challenged everything he had been taught to accept about Africa's place in the world. The university library became his second home, where he spent countless hours reading books about African history, politics, and economics. He discovered works by revolutionary thinkers like Frantz Fanon, who wrote about the psychological effects of colonialism, and Walter Rodney, who explained how Europe underdeveloped Africa through centuries of exploitation. These readings opened Ibrahim's eyes to patterns that he had observed but never fully understood. He began to see how the colonial system had been designed not just to extract wealth from Africa, but to create lasting dependence that would continue even after political independence. The colonial powers had deliberately prevented Africans from developing their own industries, technologies, and institutions, ensuring that they would remain dependent on foreign expertise and investment. Ibrahim also discovered the writings of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader whose story had inspired him since childhood. Reading Sankara's speeches and policy documents gave Ibrahim a deeper understanding of what genuine African independence might look like. Sankara had not just criticized foreign domination. He had proposed concrete alternatives based on African self-reliance and dignity. The dormitory where Ibrahim lived became a center for intense political discussions among students who shared his concerns about Africa's future. Late into the night, these young intellectuals would debate the causes of Africa's problems and discuss possible solutions. They came from different countries across West Africa, but they shared similar frustrations with corruption, poverty, and foreign interference in their homelands. These discussions were not just theoretical exercises. The students talked about practical questions like how African countries could break free from unfair trade agreements, how they could develop their own industries, and how they could create educational systems that served African needs rather than producing graduates trained only to serve foreign interests. Ibrahim's contributions to these debates were always thoughtful and well-informed, earning him respect among his peers. During university breaks, Ibrahim would return to Bandakai and share what he was learning with his family and village elders. These conversations helped him stay connected to his roots while processing the new knowledge he was acquiring. The village elders were impressed by his growing understanding of complex issues, but they also reminded him that book knowledge was only valuable if it could be used to help real people solve real problems. Ibrahim's academic success attracted the attention of his professors, who recognized his exceptional analytical abilities and his deep commitment to using his education for the benefit of his country. Several professors encouraged him to consider pursuing advanced degrees or academic careers, but Ibrahim had different plans. He understood that the changes Africa needed would not come from universities or research institutes alone. They would require leaders who could combine intellectual understanding with practical power. As Ibrahim approached the end of his university studies, he faced a crucial decision about his future career path. Many of his classmates were planning to seek employment with multinational mining companies or international development organizations. These positions offered good salaries and comfortable lifestyles, but they also meant working within systems that perpetuated Africa's dependence on foreign expertise and investment. Ibrahim chose a different path. He decided to join the military, a decision that surprised many of his friends and professors. They could not understand why someone with his academic abilities would choose military service over a lucrative civilian career. But Ibrahim had reached a fundamental conclusion about the nature of power and change in Africa. He understood that throughout African history, meaningful change had often required force, or the credible threat of force. The colonial powers had not given up their control voluntarily. They had been forced out by liberation movements that combined political organization with military capability. Even after independence, the most successful African leaders had often been those who understood military strategy and could defend their reforms against both internal and external enemies. Ibrahim also recognized that in many African countries, the military was one of the few institutions that could potentially serve national interests rather than foreign interests. While civilian politicians often became dependent on foreign aid and investment, military leaders could potentially maintain greater independence if they had the vision and determination to do so. The decision to join the military was not just about acquiring military skills. Ibrahim saw it as essential preparation for the kind of leadership that Africa needed. He would learn discipline, strategy, and the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. He would also gain first-hand knowledge of his country, as security challenges, and the limitations of relying on foreign military assistance. Ibrahim's university years had transformed him from a bright village student into a sophisticated analyst of Africa's problems and possibilities. He had acquired the technical knowledge needed to understand his country's mineral wealth and the political understanding needed to envision how that wealth could be used for national development rather than foreign profit. Most importantly, he had developed the intellectual framework that would guide his future actions as a revolutionary leader. The young man who graduated from university was no longer just Ibrahim from Bandakai. He had become Ibrahim scholar warrior, ready to combine academic knowledge with military training in service of a vision that would ultimately transform not just Burkina Faso but all of Africa. The red earth of Bandakai held secrets that only time would reveal. In this small village where cattle grazed peacefully and children learned life lessons from their grandparents, Ibrahim spent his earliest years absorbing the wisdom and struggles of his people. The soil beneath his bare feet was the same earth that had nourished his ancestors for countless generations, and it would shape the man who would one day shake the foundations of African politics. Ibrahim's father was a hardworking man who understood the value of honest labor. Every morning before sunrise, he would prepare for another day of farming, tending to crops that fed his family and provided a small income. His hands were rough from years of working the land, but his heart was gentle when he spoke to his children about the importance of education and dignity. He often told Ibrahim that a man's true wealth was not measured in money, but in his character and his service to his community. Ibrahim's mother was equally influential in shaping her son's worldview. She was known throughout Bandakai for her kindness and wisdom. Women would come to her for advice about family matters, and she always listened with patience and understanding. From her, Ibrahim learned the importance of compassion and the power of listening to others. She would tell him stories about strong African women who had led their people through difficult times, teaching him that leadership was not limited by gender or age. The family was not wealthy by any standard, but they were rich in values and traditions. Their small mud brick house had few modern conveniences, but it was filled with love, respect, and the constant pursuit of knowledge. Books were treasured possessions in their home, and Ibrahim's parents made sure their son had access to every educational opportunity they could afford. As a young child, Ibrahim was curious about everything around him. He would ask his parents endless questions about why things worked the way they did. When he saw airplanes flying overhead, he wanted to know how they stayed in the sky. When he observed differences between rich and poor people in nearby towns, he questioned why such inequalities existed. His parents encouraged this curiosity, understanding that a questioning mind was the foundation of wisdom. The village of Bondakai was a place where traditional African culture remained strong. The community gathered regularly for festivals that celebrated their heritage and honored their ancestors. During these celebrations, Ibrahim would listen to drummers whose rhythms seemed to carry messages from the past. He watched dancers whose movements told stories of ancient kingdoms and brave warriors. These cultural experiences planted deep roots in his heart, connecting him to a proud African identity that would later fuel his revolutionary spirit. Education in rural Burkina Faso was not easy to obtain, but Ibrahim's parents were determined that their son would have opportunities they never had. They walked long distances to register him at the best school they could find, even though it meant significant financial sacrifice. Ibrahim's father often worked extra hours in other people's fields to earn money for school fees and supplies. His mother sold vegetables and handmade crafts to contribute to their son's education fund. Ibrahim did not take his parents' sacrifices lightly. He walked several kilometers to school each day, often arriving early and staying late to make the most of every learning opportunity. His teachers quickly recognized his exceptional abilities and dedication. He was not just memorizing facts. He was thinking critically about everything he learned and asking questions that showed deep understanding. In school, Ibrahim learned about African history that was often ignored or misrepresented in colonial education systems. He discovered that Africa had been home to great civilizations long before European colonizers arrived. He learned about the University of Timbuktu, which had been a center of learning when Europe was still emerging from the Dark Ages. He studied the achievements of African scientists, mathematicians, and philosophers who had made important contributions to human knowledge. These historical lessons had a profound impact on young Ibrahim. He began to understand that the poverty and problems he saw around him were not natural or inevitable. Africa had once been prosperous and powerful. The current difficulties were largely the result of external interference and exploitation. This realization filled him with both anger at the injustices and determination to help restore Africa's greatness. Ibrahim's favorite subject was geography, partly because it helped him understand the broader context of his continent's situation. He learned about Africa's vast natural resources, including gold, diamonds, oil, and uranium. He discovered that many African countries were rich in these valuable materials, but remained poor because foreign companies extracted the wealth and sent profits overseas. This knowledge sparked his early interest in geology and resource management. Outside of formal education, Ibrahim learned valuable lessons from the village elders who served as living libraries of traditional knowledge. These wise men and women had witnessed the transition from colonial rule to independence, and they shared their experiences with younger generations. They told Ibrahim about the promises that had been made during the independence struggle and the disappointments that followed. New African leaders often behaved like the colonizers they had replaced. One elderly man named Amadou became particularly important in Ibrahim's intellectual development. Amadou had been a young man during the independence movement and remembered the excitement and hope of that time, but he also remembered how quickly that hope had turned to disillusionment, as corruption and foreign influence continued to dominate African politics. Amadou taught Ibrahim that true independence required more than just changing flags and national anthems. It required fundamental changes in how African societies were organized and governed. The stories about Thomas Sankara had a special impact on Ibrahim during these formative years. Sankara had become president of Burkina Faso when Ibrahim was too young to understand politics, but the legacy of his revolutionary ideas continued to inspire people throughout the country. Village elders described how Sankara had tried to make Burkina Faso truly independent by reducing foreign influence, fighting corruption, and empowering ordinary people. Ibrahim learned that Sankara had encouraged people to buy local products instead of expensive foreign goods. He had promoted women's rights and education for all children. He had tried to make government officials live simply instead of enriching themselves at public expense. Most importantly, Sankara had insisted that Africans should be proud of their culture and heritage, instead of copying European and American ways of life. The tragic end of Sankara's story also taught Ibrahim Important lessons about the dangers faced by revolutionary leaders. Sankara had been killed by political enemies who were supported by foreign powers that wanted to maintain their influence in Burkina Faso. This taught Ibrahim that anyone who seriously challenged the existing system would face powerful opposition and personal risks. As Ibrahim grew from childhood into adolescence, the combination of formal education, traditional wisdom, and family values created a unique worldview that would guide his future actions. He understood that Africa's problems were complex and interconnected, requiring solutions that addressed both internal corruption and external exploitation. He knew that meaningful change would require courage, sacrifice, and the support of ordinary people who shared his vision of a better future. The red earth of Bandakai had given Ibrahim strong roots that connected him to his people as history and aspirations. These roots would sustain him through the challenges ahead and remind him always of the simple village values that shaped his character. The boy who played in the dust of Bandakai was growing into a young man with the knowledge, determination, and vision needed to lead a revolution that would transform not just Burkina Faso, but all of Africa. The morning sun rose over the small village of Bandakai in Burkina Faso on a day that would change Africa forever. It was September 30th, 2022, and Captain Ibrahim was about to become the youngest leader in the world. But his story did not begin on that historic day. It started 34 years earlier in the same red soil where he now stood as a revolutionary leader. Ibrahim was born in 1988 in a quiet village in western Burkina Faso. The village was like many others in West Africa. Children played in dusty streets while their mothers sold vegetables in small markets. Fathers worked hard in fields under the hot African sun. Life moved slowly and peacefully, following traditions that had existed for hundreds of years. But even in this simple village, young Ibrahim was different. His eyes held a fire that his neighbors noticed from an early age. When other children were content to play games, Ibrahim asked questions. He wanted to know why some people had more than others. He wondered why his country seemed poor when the ground beneath their feet held so much gold and other valuable minerals. The boy who would one day lead a nation grew up hearing stories that shaped his young mind. Village elders would gather under the big baobab tree in the center of Bandakai and tell tales of great African leaders. They spoke of ancient kings who ruled vast empires. They talked about brave warriors who fought against foreign invaders. Most importantly, they told stories about Thomas Sankara had been the leader of Burkina Faso from 1983 to 1987. He was a revolutionary who wanted to make his country truly independent. Sankara believed that African nations should control their own resources and make their own decisions. He built schools and hospitals. He fought against corruption. He told his people to be proud of being African. But powerful enemies killed Sankara in 1987, just 1 year before Ibrahim was born. As Ibrahim grew older, these stories about Sankara became more than just tales told by old men. They became a vision of what Burkina Faso could be again. The young boy began to understand that his country was not truly free, even though it had gained independence from France in 1960. Foreign companies still took most of the wealth from Burkina Faso's mines. Foreign governments still had too much control over important decisions. Ibrahim's parents were not rich, but they understood the power of education. They worked extra hours and saved every coin they could to send their son to school. They knew that education was the only way their child could have a better life. Ibrahim did not disappoint them. He was the best student in his class year after year. At school, Ibrahim learned about the world beyond his village. He studied geography and learned that Africa was a huge continent with incredible natural wealth. He studied history and discovered that European colonizers had divided Africa among themselves, without asking African people what they wanted. He learned that even after independence, many African countries remained poor while foreign companies became rich from African resources. These lessons made Ibrahim angry, but they also made him determined. He began to dream of a different future for his country and his continent. He imagined an Africa where children could go to good schools and receive excellent medical care. He pictured African countries working together as equal partners with the rest of the world, not as servants begging for help. When Ibrahim was a teenager, he watched as his country struggled with many problems. Terrorist groups attacked villages in the north. Young people could not find jobs even after finishing school. Hospitals lacked medicine and equipment. Roads were full of holes that made travel difficult and dangerous. The government seemed unable to solve these problems. At the same time, Ibrahim noticed that foreign countries always seemed ready to offer help, but their help came with conditions. If Burkina Faso wanted loans to build roads, foreign banks demanded control over how the money was spent. If the country needed military assistance to fight terrorists, foreign armies wanted permanent bases on Burkina Faso soil. This pattern reminded Ibrahim of the colonial period that he had studied in school. The young man began to understand that real change would require more than good intentions. It would need strong leadership and the courage to stand up to powerful interests. He saw that traditional politics had failed his country. Politicians made promises during elections, but forgot about ordinary people after winning power. They seemed more interested in pleasing foreign governments than solving local problems. Ibrahim decided that he needed skills that would help him serve his country effectively. He chose to study geology, because he wanted to understand the mineral wealth that lay beneath African soil. If Africa was going to control its own resources, Africans needed to understand exactly what those resources were and where to find them. After finishing his studies, Ibraheem joined the military. This decision surprised some of his friends who thought he would become a civilian engineer. But Ibraheem understood something that others missed. In a continent where change often came through force, military training was essential for any serious leader. The military would teach him discipline, strategy, and leadership skills that he could not learn anywhere else. In the army, Ibraheem quickly stood out as an exceptional soldier and leader. His fellow soldiers respected his intelligence and his dedication to serving his country. Officers recognized his potential and gave him increasing responsibilities. But military service also opened Ibraheem's eyes to new problems. He saw how foreign military advisors influenced important decisions about Burkina Faso's security. He witnessed corruption among senior officers who cared more about personal profit than protecting their people. He observed how inadequate equipment and training made it difficult for Burkina Faso's soldiers to effectively fight against well-armed terrorist groups. These experiences convinced Ibraheem that fundamental change was necessary. It was not enough to reform the existing system. The entire approach to governance needed to be transformed. Burkina Faso needed leaders who would put the country's interests first, even when doing so meant challenging powerful foreign governments and corporations. By 2022, Ibraheem had become captain, a respected military officer with a clear vision for his country's future. He had spent years building relationships with other young officers who shared his revolutionary ideas. Together, they planned for the day when they would have the opportunity to implement real change. That opportunity came on September 30th, 2022, when Captain Ibraheem led a military coup that would make him the youngest head of state in the world, but more importantly, it made him the leader of a new movement for African independence and dignity. The boy from Bondakai had become the man who would challenge the entire global system that kept Africa dependent and poor. Standing before his nation on that historic day, Ibraheem represented more than just a new government. He embodied the dreams of millions of young Africans who wanted their continent to take its rightful place in the world. His journey from village boy to revolutionary leader had prepared him for the enormous challenges that lay ahead. The dawn of a new era had begun in Burkina Faso, and the rest of Africa was watching with hope and excitement.